Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and it's a day when both sides are taking to the streets in Venezuela. The standoff and the tension has been spiraling the past couple of weeks. We're talking about it with writer Vincent Olive, the author of Who Killed Simon Bolivar. With us from Caracas, Lucas Kerner, journalist with Venezuela Analysis. Welcome back as well to Daniel Landsberg Rodriguez, who teaches at the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University, and the Cato Institute's Juan Carlos Hidalgo is with us from Washington. Just before the break, Juan Carlos saying how the problem is for the opposition is that it's splintered, demanding different things. Let me ask you, Lucas Kerner, the opposition splintered, but we saw as well that, for instance, last week there was that rally in San Felix where the president was heckled. Is the country, are the traditional pro-Chavez forces squarely behind this president at this point?
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize that the opposition is actually far more divided than the government when you look at it. Actually, if we look at the latest data analysis statistics, President Maduro's approval rating since November has increased 6 points from 18% to 24%, making him more popular than Enrique Peña Nieto in Mexico, Michel Temer in Brazil, and Michelle Bachelet in Chile. So the reality is that, in fact, the opposition's popularity, according to Hinterlasses, the independent polling firm, has declined, with 64% of Venezuelans negatively evaluating the national held opposition assembly. Why is this? Because the National Assembly has focused all of its attention on attempting to oust Maduro. When it was elected in December 2015, an election that was recognized by the government, what dictatorships recognize elections, come on. But the opposition, within days of being sworn in January 2016, declared that its goal to remove Maduro within 6 months, which was constitutionally, completely not allowed. It was impossible. Moreover, other pieces of legislation attempted to pass.
Yeah, but you have in the Constitution, and it's something that has been touted by one of the candidates here in France on the campaign trail. You have this recall referendum possibility, and there were all these obstacles put in the way to prevent that recall referendum from happening.
Well, let's begin that the recall referendum is a very complicated process. It takes 8 to 10 months to do, and then the opposition did not begin the process until April. First of all, it sought to oust the government through other means. It declared in March that it had a 4-pronged strategy. One of them was just protest of forced resignation. Another one attempted to pass a constitutional amendment to retroactively shorten the presidential term, which was obviously constitutionally, prohibited. And then it also attempted to rewrite the Constitution, which it soon realized would be impossible because Venezuela's Constitution is actually very popular. So as you said, the opposition is very divided, where you have an important section of the opposition, including the very right-wing Popular Will Party, whose leader, Freddy Guevara, declared on April 9th that after Maduro called for regional elections, that regional elections in respect for the National Assembly are important, but general elections are necessary. We cannot stop while we have our people in the street. This is basically a direct quote. This is the reality, that these people will not stop until they oust the president, whether it's through democratic means like a recall referendum, or largely since 2002, it's been a series of coup attempts, and with the support of the United States. Let's not forget the Venezuelan opposition is heavily financed by U.S. aid.
Let's not go back. Come on. Let me bring in Daniel Landsberg on this. And I'm going to ask you, Daniel, the same question that we asked last time: is how do you tone it down? How do you bring both sides to the table? We saw attempts by the Catholic Church that have so far, not gone very far. How do you tone this down?
Well, I think it actually feeds into the point that's been made several times during this debate of this idea of the opposition is very disorganized and it's very divided. You have different groups within the opposition which have different priorities, and that's something that is exacerbated by the government. For example, by putting the leader of Freddy Guevara's party, Voluntad Popular, that Lucas just mentioned, in prison for 2 years for a crime that did not exist when he supposedly committed it. That is something that obviously pulls that section of the opposition in one direction, whereas other sections of the opposition may feel more about, they want better institutional representation, or they want elections to be done on time. So by pushing different factions of the opposition in different directions, and by making sure that all of the people who start rising within the opposition are either legally disallowed to hold office, or are thrown in jail, or are forced into exile, that creates a constant stream of reinvention within the opposition, which makes it very difficult to have coherence. And this is something that also makes it difficult to negotiate. Because there's different parts of the opposition that want different things. But the idea that negotiation is something that's actually been tried is a premise that I don't fully buy into. The government has time and again sought to buy itself time. The world does not tend to stay focused on things for very long. New crises arise, and things like when Maduro, as sort of Supreme Court that has never ruled against him, decided to formally dissolve Parliament rather than just striking down every law, that makes very big news for a few days. But the only way to really keep it going is protest. And in the past, as with the Vatican dialogues, the protest has been basically ameliorated as a social force, even though it's a protected right within the Constitution, by drawing on the international community to say, hey, dialogue is great, we need dialogue, and that buys time. And then the dialogue never goes anywhere. The world's attention moves on. The opposition feels frustrated. The internal divisions exacerbate, and rinse and repeat the next time the government does something like dissolve Parliament, or like suspend the recall referendum, etc.
Right.
None of this is new.
Neighbors are worried. Earlier, the president of Colombia, Juan Manuel Santos, he tweeted the following: "I've reached out to the Security Council to draw the UN Secretary General's attention to the disturbing militarization of Venezuelan society." At this point in time, Juan Carlos Hidalgo, how should neighboring states react?
Well, this militarization of the Venezuelan state has been taking place for the last 18 years. I don't know why President Santos just realized that. He actually has been quite the accomplice with the Venezuelan regime, not paying attention to what's been going on in that country. The problem is that Venezuela is increasingly a failed state. You have hundreds of thousands of people moving into the Colombian border, looking for medicine, looking for food, because there's a humanitarian crisis in that country. So I guess that we're reaching a tipping point where neighbors are going to be increasingly worried about the situation in Venezuela. The problem is the following. In Brazil, the new president is critical of Venezuela, but he has his own problems. A major corruption scandal, 8 ministers being implicated in this corruption scandal. The president himself might be implicated anytime soon. So he won't devote the attention to the Venezuelan crisis. On the other hand, President Santos also has his own problems. He's being besieged by low popularity numbers. He just engaged in a very difficult peace process with the FARC guerrilla. That was defeated in a referendum he conducted. So the neighbors have their own problems, and they don't have the time or the interest in paying attention or getting involved in what's going on in Venezuela. Ultimately, the solution to the Venezuelan problem is going to be with Venezuelans themselves. And the problem, as we've been discussing lately, is that the opposition is divided on exactly what it wants. And as long as the opposition is divided and doesn't present a united front, I think that the government is going to have the upper hand.
On the hashtag F24 debate, one viewer with a propensity to find vital national interests halfway around the world. It's hard to believe the U.S. doesn't lead a charge to relieve Venezuela. So far, the Trump administration does have other priorities. Would they be helping or hurting if they got more involved in this one, Vincent?
Well, I think it's naive to think that the Russians don't have a vested interest in France, or that the Chinese don't have a vested interest in the politics of the countries that are around them. So yes, the United States always have a vested interest in all the countries in Latin America. Does that mean that the United States are actively acting in order to overthrow President Maduro through violent means. Maduro says yes, and he has shown nary the proof. So I don't believe him, because it's like the boy that cried wolf. It's been said many, many times. And yes, the United States needs to step down and not say absolutely anything about Venezuela. It can only worsen our case if Mr. Trump decides to take a stand.
Daniel Landsberg, let me ask you something, because at the same time as Venezuela is pointing the finger at Washington again, there's still transactions going on. There's still, for instance, Venezuelan honoring their debts with bondholders in the United States. What is the relationship these days, really, between Caracas and Washington?
Well, I mean, economic relations between Caracas and Washington haven't really changed beyond the Venezuelan private sector shutting down a bit more, and some diversification in as much as oil exports is concerned, mostly in the form of sort of oil for cash deals with China. There is geopolitical influence at work there as well. China has often stepped up to help Venezuela with liquidity problems and with further investment at times when it's becoming more and more isolated due to some of its policies with the rest of the region. What you bring up about having despite all this chaos, still paid its Wall Street creditors, I think is one of the most interesting and to some extent novel pieces of this situation. Venezuela's leaders have come to the supposition that if they wait it out, wait for oil prices to go up, wait for people to get tired, they can pretty much survive anything. What they have to avoid is big, unexpected crises. And one of those potential crises could be defaulting on foreign debt. Venezuela is incapable of feeding itself due to lack of productivity, overdependence on oil. It's very import dependent. If you were to default on foreign debt and letters of credit for imports were no longer useful, that could exacerbate those problems. If oil tankers could be seized when they're trying to export what is Venezuela's essentially only source of FX, of foreign income, that would also be a big problem. So there's also a calculus that the money you would save in defaulting, even as the debts pile up and are harder to pay each time, may actually end up being more expensive or be significantly less than the additional costs of having defaulted. So on the one hand, you have this bellicose anti-imperialist rhetoric. And on the other hand, you have a government that is withholding basic goods or FX to buy basic goods from its own people, which it claims to represent to pay Wall Street. So there's an internal irony there, which I think is impressive.
All right, you talk about seizing tankers. The Reuters news agency telling the story on Tuesday of the NS Columbus, a tanker owned by Venezuela's state-owned oil company that was seized back in October in the Caribbean Dutch island of St. Martin. The Russian state-owned shipping conglomerate Sovcomflot, tired of waiting for $30 million of unpaid shipping fees, the ship is still sequestered. Lucas Kerner, what does that story tell you?
Yeah, I think I want to return to a prior point that I think that let's listen to what the majority of Venezuelans, percent of Venezuelans disapprove of international intervention to remove President Maduro. And I mean, the question is, what moral authority does the United States or its neighbors have to intervene in Venezuela when you have the United States supporting, decades or, even a century of coups in Latin America, most recently in Haiti, in Venezuela in 2002, which many of the top opposition leaders today...
You say intervene, but intervene how? Earlier we had the Mexican ambassador on and we asked him, should there be sanctions? And he said, no, the OAS doesn't believe in sanctions, the Organization of American States. They simply are calling for the respect of human rights.
I mean, to intervene, to threaten to apply the OAS Democratic Charter against Venezuela, yet to speak nothing of Brazil, where there actually was a parliamentary coup last year that the international media seems unconcerned about, or Mexico, where, the fifth journalist has been killed in 7 weeks. I mean, where you basically have a narco, regime in power there. I mean, to speak, or, Honduras, which is the most dangerous country for environmental activists, whose regime, which is pretty illegitimate because it was elected in the wake of the coup against Manuel Zelaya, that was supported by Hillary Clinton. To speak of intervention in Venezuela when we have all of these cases is absolutely ridiculous. And I think that we have to listen to what do Venezuelans want. And if this is a brutal, murderous regime, then why haven't the barrios joined in? Why haven't, where the vast majority of Venezuela's poor population live, why haven't they joined into protests like they did in 1989 in the Caracazo? They brought down the two-party regime that existed in that time. If these people were to take part in the protest, this government would collapse, yet they haven't. And it's clear why, because we look at the statistics that Henry Lasses has shown that 61% of Venezuelans don't think the opposition can resolve the economic problems. Over 80% support dialogue, and they think that they should be centered on resolving the economic problems. They are unconcerned about ousting Maduro. They don't want regime change. 64% of Venezuelans prefer the existing economic model be made more efficient in lieu of changing the model. So this goes to show you what they want is to sit down with the opposition and resolve the economic problems, which are real, though it's not mass starvation as the international media can say. And I can talk about
Juan Carlos Hidalgo, let me get your reaction. Is there a double standard when it comes to Venezuela on the part of Latin American neighbors?
No, we have a country where you have political prisoners. You have a country where the will of the people represented in the latest legislative election has been disregarded by the Supreme Court. You have a country that has become a narco dictatorship. That's what it is. Let's remember that 90% of the cocaine that goes out of Colombia goes through Venezuela on way to Europe, on way to the United States. And leaders of the government, including the vice president himself, have been named as part of a cartel, of a drug cartel. And that's why this situation is so dangerous, because the alternative for people in government and the army in Venezuela is not retiring, to a farm, to an hacienda with a government pension in case they lose power. The alternative for these people is going to jail or being extradited to the United States or going into exile in Cuba. So that's why they're not going to leave power easily. They're not going to allow a free election. If Lucas is so confident on these poll numbers he's mentioning, why not having a free election then? But the problem is that these people, if they lose power, they're probably facing justice. And that's why that's something they don't want. So they're going to cling to power as most as they can. They're going to rely on repression. They're going to rely on violence. And I'm afraid that unless the people of Venezuela, the people in the streets right now, present a united front, we're not going to see the back of the Venezuelan regime anytime soon. And if we have a precedent for that, look at Cuba. It's been a dictatorship for 50 years. And nothing is happening in that prison island.
Vincent Uribe, your thoughts on this?
Yes, I think it's very obvious that Venezuela is a country where you have elections as long as you can win them. I seriously contend Mr. Lucas's statistics right there. If you look at Petare is the biggest slum in all of Latin America, literally. And they voted against Chavez and against Maduro. So I'm really hard-pressed to understand his conception that this is an East-West kind of thing. On the other hand, how can we have an election in Venezuela when you have three of the spearheads of the opposition, Maria Corina Machado, Enrique Capriles, and Leopoldo Lopez, who is in jail? They can't run. They're barred from running. So each time the opposition does something and actually manages to amass some kind of power, as through the National Assembly, then they strip the power away. So it's very difficult to believe in the democratic bona fides of this government.
All right, let me ask you then, looking at the French presidential race, it's the first round in 4 days' time. One of the people who could be in the second round is an admirer of Hugo Chavez, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, the far-left candidate.
Yes.
What do Venezuelans here think of that?
Well, Venezuelans are shocked and a little bit insulted. Mélenchon voted last year against a resolution in the European Union that would have allowed for the investigation of political prisoners in Venezuela. Not a resolution to condemn anybody, just to investigate that. He opposed that, and he has been backing Chavez ever since. So it's a little bit insulting. He tends to have the same approach as Mr. Lucas has, where the people in the opposition are all rich and are all in the East, and then it's the poor, happy people that are with the government.
Daniel Landsberg, more broadly, pendulum swings, they happen in every country, from left to right, from right to left. More broadly, for the rest of Latin America, what's the impact going to be on the left in other countries?
That's a great question. Before I answer it, though, there's one thing I want to say about the West not protesting. The levels of scarcity make that very difficult, because when you have to wait in line for food every day, the costs of going out to protest are much higher than when it's simply a matter of missing work or school. But with that out of the way, looking at it through a more regional lens, it's curious what has taken place. Latin America in part due to its economic boom-bust cycles and in part due to its weak institutions, tends to have a bit of a messianic relationship with its leaders historically. So whereas in the US or maybe in France, a popular president has maybe 58, 60% approval, and an unpopular president has maybe 40. In Latin America, it's much more common to see swings from 80 when a president's popular, like Lula was or like Uribe was, even though they were on opposite sides of the spectrum, to 20 or even 10 when they're not. As a result of that, lacking the sort of parliamentary democracy ability that most of European countries have of doing a vote of no confidence, as would take place in Britain, for example, when a president goes to 20% or 15% approval, and being able to move on from there, you'll end up with presidents who have 2 or 3 years left on their mandates, but have lost the ability to govern, either because they've lost the legislature or because they're too unpopular among the people. That creates what essentially become proxy votes of no confidence, either as judicial impeachments, legislative impeachments, sometimes on fundamentally unsound grounds, or in Venezuela's case, the recall referendum. So there was a shift, and part of this is cyclical. At the same time, the left's ability, when we talk about the Latin American left, there's always been a similarity in rhetoric to a certain extent. But from a policy angle, for example, Lula's first term wasn't that different from Cardozo's. You haven't had a lot, whereas Ecuador's recently re-elected a ruling party, not president, whereas they will have similar habits when it comes to, for example, journalists going to jail or shutting down newspapers, as Chavez may. You have the US dollar as a currency. So we can't look at the left as sort of hegemonic. What we can say is that Venezuela's failure has actually made a lesson about leading the left, I think, more than about tacking to the left. Venezuela was financing left-wing revolutions throughout Latin America for years. They were building up credibility in the OAS, the United Nations, through subsidized oil payments. And now that that money is gone, the world is either ignoring them or criticizing them. And I think that that will make future leaders who are populists probably less likely to take the Chavez tack of trying to lead an international revolution rather than the more conventional tactic of trying to lead a nationalist revolution.
Daniel Landsberg, we're out of time, but I want to thank you for joining us from Chicago. We're going to leave it there. I want to thank as well Juan Carlos Hidalgo in Washington, Lucas Kerner in Caracas, and as well Vincent Ulive. Stay with us because Media Watch is next.
Thank you.
We say hello to Deeptika Laurent.
Hi, François.
It's all playing out in the streets.
That's right. 19th of April 2017 will be an important day for Venezuelans. First of all, it marks the 207th anniversary of the signing of their Declaration of Independence. A very timely day also to have these pro-government and anti-government uprisings. The Washington Post is talking about a country on edge, Venezuela on edge, as these protests, these dueling rallies take place. And what's been called the mother of all protests is indeed pushing the country to the brink. And what's interesting is each side is trying to, I guess, take advantage of the situation to push their agenda. You have Nicolas Maduro, who tweeted this earlier, saying the revolutionary people have spilled into the streets of Venezuela to defend the country and I guess its president, a very patriotic sort of
the hashtag yes to marching for the nation,
for the nation, for our patrimony, if you like. And now on the other side of the political spectrum, you have Enrique Capriles, who tweeted this, saying, "Mark this day, April the 19th, when," he says, "millions of Venezuelans took to the streets against the government. Mark this hour, 11:30 in the morning. Mark this day." And Capriles and many others have also been tweeting about what they call the sort of early serious incidents, tear gas being fired on protesters, as you see in this video that Capriles posted, and also a 19-year-old protester who was allegedly shot by government forces and is allegedly fighting for his life now. This has been tweeted. You see the aftermath of that reported attack, and Capriles has also been tweeting about this to show that the protests have been getting violent to a certain extent.
Yeah, we were talking about the fact that it's hard to document what's going on because there isn't much of an opposition press in Venezuela. How do you verify your facts?
Well, yeah, I also wanted to add one thing. It's that the government, the pro-government protests, if you work in Venezuela for the state, you are forced to protest. If you don't protest, you're fired from your job. This has been said on live TV by Diosdado Cabello. I'm not making this up. So the people that manifest the protest for the government, some of them are coerced to do so. And yes, when you have this media blackout, it's very tough to follow the news from Venezuela because, yes, all the media has been constrained.
Well, I just want to, it's interesting, people have been, and it's hard to verify the information we're seeing on Twitter. We've also been, the choice that we've been making, we've been hesitant because we don't know if we can show this, which side this is coming from, what the political agenda is. I just want to end on a really interesting article from the LA Times. They've interviewed a guy called Hassler Iglesias, and he went from student protester to, I quote, an effective critic of the embattled federal government. He's got a healthy following on Twitter, and essentially he's the face of the Venezuelan youth. And I just want to end on this tweet. He says he's actually faced death threats for his action against Maduro. And in this tweet, he says, the regime wants to stop our journey with violence. They cannot stop us, he says. We will continue. The opposition is indeed determined to end this with Maduro out of power.
Many thanks for that. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.